Hello, my name is Jarrett. I'm a professional game developer, and I like to talk about game design. So, let's talk game design. I don't think it's very controversial for me to say that enemy variety is an important part of action games. Nobody wants to fight the same monster over and over. But just having a lot of them isn't enough. Plenty of games, even with a laundry list of enemies, still get repetitive. So how do we design enemies that keep the game engaging? There are a lot of answers to this question, but I want to look at it from the perspective of player-focused design. How does the player interact with the enemies, and how does that affect the game's variety? This may seem obvious, but I think a lot of games miss this, designing enemies that feel the same. So let's compare a couple of games, Mr. Shifty and Ape Out, and see how their enemies affect the player. Mr. Shifty is a 2017 game developed by the aptly named Team Shifty, published by tinyBuild. In it, players control the titular Mr. Shifty and fight their way through an office building filled with armed guards. Players run around punching enemies and use Mr. Shifty's short-range teleport to reposition and avoid enemy attacks. This game has a lot of different kinds of enemies. Pistol guards, shotgun guys, bruisers, grenade lobbers, and a whole bunch of others. Unfortunately, fighting them is a strikingly similar experience. Let's look at this fight in level 4. A new player might start the game and approach a fight like this, thinking, I should get behind the wall to avoid the fire, then take out the shotgunners first. Once they're down, I can stay near the wall, and that will help me take out the remaining guards. Unfortunately, after a few fights, that thought process will probably devolve into something more like an enemy jump punch punch, another jump punch punch, another jump punch punch. It rarely matters what challenge is being thrown at you. The response is teleport, punch punch. So, why is this the case? The enemies are different. Some fire a burst, some shoot flames. There are even ninjas that have a dash attack. The issue is that you, the player, interact with them in fundamentally the same way. Every attack can be avoided with a teleport, and every enemy can be taken out with a few punches. Yes, some enemies have more chances to hit you, but none break the rule that you teleport out of the way when an enemy is aiming at you, and then you throw a few punches when you're clear. This means fights get repetitive. Fast. Whether the game is throwing everything but the kitchen sink at you, or you're fighting some pistol guards. You teleport around, and then you punch. I don't mean to just harp on this game. It has its merits, and there are some elements I think it does well. What I do think is that it's a very clear example of how design that isn't player-focused can be wasted. There's a lot of content in this game, but it rarely affects the player, so it often feels like there's barely any variety at all. But the question remains, how do we design enemies that add variety? Ape Out is a 2019 game, developed by Gabe Casillo, with music from Matt Bong and art from Bennett Foddy, published by Devolver Digital. Similar to Mr. Shifty, players fight their way through a series of floors filled with guards. But here, instead of punching and teleporting, the player gorilla can grab and throw enemies. At first, the player is facing these rifle and shotgun enemies. Players will quickly get into the swing of ducking between cover, throwing enemies into walls when they're in range, and occasionally using one as a shield when exposed. But soon, the game introduces these explosive enemies. Their rifles are the same as the others, but throwing them into walls is rather risky. And they make for terrible shields. It may seem minor, but the fact these guards detonate on death completely changes how a player might approach a fight. You can no longer just throw an enemy as soon as it's close enough. Now you have to watch what you're up against, and make sure that you deal with the explosive ones properly. A lot of the other enemies also help change up the player's approach. Shotgun enemies are armored, making them hard to take out with projectiles, but more effective as shields. and machine gunners fire a bunch, so they tear through shields, but they're great for taking out groups. They're not wildly different, but they can't all be fought in the exact same way, so the fights stay fresh and stop the game from getting too repetitive. When mixed together, they can add a whole new dimension to otherwise standard fights. I'll be the first to admit there are other elements at play here. Ape Out's enemies often play off the level design to encourage the player to use them, while Mr. Shifty's base power set is so effective, it's difficult to encourage other behavior, but I think that's a discussion for another day. For now, just don't forget about the player. Enemies that are different from each other are great, but if you can design them to be different for the player to interact with, that can add a whole new level of variety. Be it something as simple as a priority target, or as subtle as an exploding backpack, variety is only variety for the player if they have to play the game differently. Both of these games have their merits, but when you look at the enemies, I think it's clear. It pays to think of the player first. Thank you for watching my first ever video. I've been meaning to do these for a while. There are lots of other aspects of game design I'd like to talk about, so hopefully more of these will be coming soon. Until then, thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.